There are almost 2 million public school students in Ontario, and they attend schools operated by local boards and authorities whose duty it is to ensure student achievement and well-being for all students. But several recent reports of discrimination have raised serious concerns about how well they're living up to that mandate and whether it's time for some major reform. Joining us now to consider that, Kika Ojo. She is Project Manager, One Vision, One Voice at the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies. And Martin Regcon is here, the Ontario politics columnist at the Toronto Star. And it's good to see both of you back again here in these parts of the capital city. I just want to, Kika, you first. Let's get some overall impressions of the investigative report that was just released on the situation at the York Region District School Board. First thoughts.
Sobering. But I also think it's, I think the community is grateful. I mean, many people know a lot of what was said, and it was high time that it was, put in print.
Martin.
My reaction was another year, another report. And once again, we find that trustees don't really know what they're supposed to do, what their role is. They feel they have this democratic connection, but when it comes time to actually connect with their constituents and master their role and do what they're supposed to do, it turns out, as this report finds, they don't actually know what their role is.
We will follow up on the trustee angle a little bit later. I want to pick up on that word you used, sobering. Meaning what?
Meaning that there seems to be a lot of issues that haven't come to light, that you kind of hear whisperings about, you hear murmurs about, the meetings after the meeting, and there it was, sort of plain and clear and crisp. And so sobering as in literally from sort of fogginess to clarity around exactly what the issues are, how they play out, and who's impacted.
Martin, a lot of this known, but good to see it in print and finally come out in some kind of official capacity. Can we say that?
Disturbing to see it in print. A lot of it, I have to say, was aired in the pages of our newspaper. The Toronto Star, Noor Javid and Kristen Rashowi had documented a lot of this before, but to see it all put together by an outside investigator, to see that some of the details brought out about the amount of travel. I mean, everyone was talking about the issues of racism, of Islamophobia that had cropped up, that were so disturbing. They almost overshadowed some of the other issues of incompetence and or overreach. Some trustees traveling to Europe 3 times to the same place, going to Hawaii, going to New Zealand. And that's the kind of thing people can understand. Why are trustees at a local level traveling that far away? As far as I could tell from my inquiries, I couldn't see any trips to Saskatchewan or Manitoba or Quebec
or
to see how
right,
neighboring jurisdictions were doing their work.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second on that one. I mean, the reality is people in public life travel. They have to travel, they go to conferences, they try to obviously network, and they try to understand best practices in other jurisdictions. Often the organizations that put on these conferences put them on in places that people want to go to. Shock, shock. So are you really all that fussed about this?
Yeah, because they went, first of all, New Zealand's a long way from York Region, and secondly, Finland, for a third try, is pushing the envelope. So it's the return trips. And I mention that not to be a kind of a nitpicker, but that is a systemic issue that in my view, of recurring travel to places, and importantly though, the outside investigation found that they didn't actually document anything that they had learned on these travels. There was no transparency, there was no reporting afterwards.
That's problematic.
And there was no indication of what they had learned. So,
all right.
Problem.
Let's cast our net a little more widely, because even though clearly there were issues at the York Board that have now come to light in an official capacity, the Toronto District School Board also released some figures on the same day that the York Board review came out, showing that 48% of its expelled students over the past 5 years were black. And yet black kids make up 12% of TDSB students. 48% expelled from 12% of the students. Is there a widespread race problem in school boards all over the place?
Absolutely.
You're nodding your head, yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that, we haven't really begun to, we've attempted to address the issues after they happen and after they're made, into horrible circumstances, as opposed to looking at our base assumptions in the first place. So our assumptions about this country, about this province, about towns and cities that appear to have multicultural populations, and the assumption that that multiculturalism equals equality of access, equality of experience, and equality of outcomes, and we keep seeing results that prove that, in fact, that multiculturalism in itself, having a population of racialized people, of mixed racialized people in a community, does not equal equality of access. And I think those stats speak to that.
So let's understand this. You think we talk a good game on multiculturalism and diversity, but when push comes to shove, we're not there.
And in fact, it's served to prevent us from having the conversation properly and thoroughly. So, I call it the four A's. We need to assess our assumptions. We need to raise our awareness. We need to address accessibility, and we have to address accountability. And but again, starting with this idea that what are our base assumptions? Because if the base assumption is that because we're multicultural, or because we're Canada and we're not the U.S., we're multicultural, whatever the ideas are, if that is the base assumption, then you're not actually going to put in place mitigating processes and mechanisms. You're not going to put those in place. And so we continue to see outcomes like this. You're not going to question the rate of suspension, question the rate of expulsion early enough. You're not going to question the trends, and then this is, I think, our base problem.
Is there an explanation other than racism for why such a disproportionate number of black kids would be expelled relative to their numbers in the general population?
That's a tough question.
I like that pause. That means you thought of it. You're thinking. I like that.
Well, I'm not an expert in that area. Kika is. But there's always a question about cause and effect. And what I would suggest is that this kind of data doesn't always prove things, and I'll be interested to hear what Kika's view is on that. But it's certainly a warning flag. So it's a clue that you need to look at what's happening in case there are systemic causes. Systemic issues aren't always going to explain individual outcomes, obviously. But you can't just brush it aside and say, well, cause effect, we don't know causality, there may be spurious correlations. Well, these kinds of numbers, these trends can be worrisome. They don't necessarily prove racism is everywhere, but I think they suggest that we need to watch out for what's happening.
But I think I don't disagree with, I think, Martin's approach, but I think that it's not like we haven't had scores and scores and scores of data telling us this very information. This is not new news. Certainly it's not only true in the Toronto District School Board. I think that multiple school boards have very similar outcomes. It's true in child welfare. It's true in policing. We're seeing a trend. And so if you ask the community what's going on, the community will tell you that, in fact, it's racism.
That's what the community will say. But if I want to go outside the community, if I want to cast the net more broadly and get other opinions, I'm going to hear from people, yeah, of course more black kids get kicked out of school because they cause more trouble.
Absolutely.
Is that accurate?
Well, if I may use a child welfare example, our research showed, so similarly in child welfare, we had, for example, the Toronto Children's Aid Society graciously, I would say, put their data on the table. 41% of the kids in care were black, but in only 8% population, right? So that's at least 5 times overrepresented. So many people would say, yeah, black families are, aggressive, violent, they don't care about their kids, whatever the case may be, except that the data, the research, in the US, which is all we have access to, showed that there are not more incidences of child maltreatment in the black community as per the white community. And if that is true in child welfare, we can assume very similarly.
There's a corollary for education.
Exactly. And it's like, or on a flip way of looking at it is, in child welfare, we have a significant number of cases, probably upwards of 90% of cases where the families are in poverty. So does that mean that rich people are naturally great parents? Is that what we're saying, right? So, it's ridiculous. We know that that's not true. So something systemic happens that allows for us to spend less attention, have less attention on families that have more money, right? That's not a natural cause. There's something else going on because we know that that's not true.
Martin, I want to ask you the same question I asked the couple that were just on the program. And it's a tricky question, but I want to put it out there anyway. The Minister of Education today in the province of Ontario is a young black woman. And I wonder 2 things. I wonder if that, in your view, because you cover Queen's Park, I wonder if that gives her added sensitivity and understanding to deal with all of these issues we've talked about today, or conversely, really puts a great deal of pressure on her to live up to expectations that the Black communities of this province may have of her? What do you think?
That's another tough question. I think that's a question people probably have internally that you have given voice to, and I don't think there has been any that I've heard questioning of Mitzi Hunter's comportment, judgment, and objectivity. I'm not saying she's the greatest politician in the world. I don't give that endorsement, but I certainly think in her handling of this, she has been quick off the mark, and her response to the report on York was thoughtful and methodical. No question, one of life's fortuitous outcomes is that you happened to have the first Black education minister in place at a time when this very difficult circumstance happened in York Region. And I think that might have offered some reassurance to parents. Whether that put any extra pressure on Mitzi Hunter, there's no suggestion that it changed her
I want Kika to follow up on that, because the reason I asked the question is more than 30 years ago, when Ontario got its first ever Black cabinet minister, a man by the name of Alvin Curling. He told me years later he went to work almost every day with a searing headache because he felt the pressure to be good for his communities. And speak to that, if you would.
I think it's balanced, right? I think for a lot of members of the community who have worked in bureaucracies, large bureaucracies, we know how difficult and challenging and careful one has to be, and those sorts of things. So I think there's a lot of compassion and whatnot for that. I think that we watch closely with any person with a lot of power who might be Black in sort of these sorts of positions, that what they say to the community they do, that they're consistent, and I think it's those sorts of things. But I would argue that the community has a really good sense of how complicated and how difficult the job is. I think the question we need to ask is, after Minister Hunter's sort of response, for example, what happens next? And in that what happens next, what I'm getting at is, how do we, or what power can she use to really define, direct, and instruct how her directives and how the recommendations in the report are followed.
Let me follow. All right. In which case, let me follow up in our remaining moments here with something that you wrote about this past week, and which you seem quite hot to trot on, which is getting rid of trustees altogether because they've outlived their usefulness. Make the case.
Well, trustees are really, they're rebels without a cause. They have lost their taxation authority decades ago, thanks to Mike Harris. It's a part-time job. They're not involved in the primary negotiations with teachers anymore. That's done now centrally by the province. So the province raises the taxes, it writes the curriculum, it does the negotiations. What exactly are trustees doing except making mischief? One of the interesting
they're
takeaways.
supposed to be taking phone calls from constituents and representing their interests at the board.
So one of the interesting takeaways from this report, one of the most revealing to me, apart from the travel excesses, was that the reviewers thought fit to note that 4 of the trustees out of the 12, 1/3, 33%, were basically positioning themselves for future runs at higher elected office. They're always in a hurry. They're always just passing through, as we say in Canada. And so that affected their judgment. So the trade-offs, the horse trading, the positioning influenced how they comported themselves as trustees.
They're more focused on future career as opposed to the job at hand.
So this idea, this false logic that somehow this is a local level of government, they're closer to the community. The fact is, it's dysfunctional at that level. Look, I love democracy. I know it's imperfect in many ways, but when I see Donald Trump or Rob Ford elected, I don't have a problem with the way it was done. I may not like those two people as politicians, but at least everybody was engaged. People watched the debates. They knew what they were getting, or thought they knew what they were getting. People don't know who their trustees are. They don't turn out in significant numbers to vote for them. Sometimes it's as low as 10% turnouts. So it is a false correlation that these trustees are somehow delivering some value to their constituents.
I may be more of a reformist on this particular issue, but the point that you make, Martin, in your articles around the electoral process, or the fact that most people don't know the trustees, is, I think, absolutely true. What if because it's about education, what if we tweaked the process? So what if it was still democratic, i.e., you go, you make your vote, whatnot, but we did a different process of informing the community? What if that was the new way that it took place?
How's that look?
So what I mean is, very intentional, a new way of engaging the community about this vote that they're about to make, a new way of engaging them about the fact that a vote is about to take place. I mean, you sort of see these, placards show up on people's lawns. You kind of feel like it happens every couple of months, like for different reasons, for different levels of government, but people don't know what's going on. And so what if we approached the engagement differently so that people actually did know about, so it might happen in churches and mosques, and, maybe they went to the PTA meetings, like what, and I say the they being, what if this whole process was done maybe by the government? I'm
Requires
worried about
the citizen engagement that we don't yet have on this.
Right, but this is what I'm talking about. So what if there was a new engagement process? Why do we assume that the process, the democratic process, the approach of engagement is the only way, is the best way? I think because even in our regular voting, mayor, et cetera, you see that certain communities are engaged far less than others. So what if we problematize that and address that? Because, and I say that only to say that you have board, you have families, but what is the body that holds the administration accountable, right? So if we got rid of that, then we wouldn't necessarily have that role. So what can we do to reform that process?
In our last 20 seconds here, do you see any appetite by the province to follow up on this?
On the report
No,
itself?
on the abolishing trustees.
No, but I think that there will be pressure down the road. I think the secret sauce here is going to be years from now when we eventually amalgamate, because we will one day. Not yet, we're not ready for it now, but when we bring the separate school board in together with the public school board, then it'll be time to look at the role of trustees, because there is not just dysfunction at the democratic level, there's also a democracy fatigue that I think would kibosh any of your really idealistic hopes for trying to engage people on this.
They are, she acknowledges. That's Kika Ojo and Martin Regcon, and we're grateful to both of you for coming into TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.